Hello and welcome to the channel. I am here for a ranking video for you guys. Now for this ranking video, I'll be going over the All That Remains discography and rank them all from worst to best. Now keep in mind this is just my opinion, and as a matter of fact, I know that some of these opinions are rather unpopular. If you disagree with this ranking, that's okay. Just, feel free to leave your ranking in the comments section. And yeah, this is just my opinion, of course. So we're going to go from worst to best. Let's go ahead and begin. And we're going to begin with what I think is the weakest All That Remains record, which is Madness. This has always been towards the bottom for me, and I remember when the singles came out, I remember, the singles being pretty much a mixed bag for me. Like, I remember, one song I kind of liked, and then, some songs that I was just kind of like, I'm not sure how to feel. But yeah, this did end up being their weakest album, in my opinion, at least. But I mean, the song Safe House is probably the best track on the album, and that is one of the heaviest tracks. And then songs like Madness, the title track, I did not care for at first, but it's grown on me a little bit, but I still can't say it's anything mind-blowing, I guess you could say. They did do some experimentation on this album, which some people might see as a good thing, but people like myself kind of saw it as a bad thing, since, they were kind of experimenting with, like, country in this album, and yeah, it doesn't really work for the band, and yeah, I'm glad that they stepped away from this on the following album that came after, of course. But yeah, Madness, it's got to be at the bottom for me. It's just not a very good album, and it has some of the band's weakest material. Next up, we got The Order of Things. Now, I know there's some people that would actually have this album below Madness, and there's people that I know that would personally put this, up there in the top 3, which is honestly kind of mind-blowing to think about. But yeah, I personally don't see it. This is another one of their weakest albums. I think the biggest problem with this album is just the mediocrity that you get in this album. Like, there's really nothing special about this album. It feels kind of like your standard alternative metal, kind of hard rock album. I can't stand, when these metal bands, do this. In Flames is also guilty of this, when they, kind of stray away from what made them good in the first place to, create a different style just to, try to attract a certain audience or whatever. But these bands' material, end up being just mediocre. Like, if I wanted to listen to this style of music, I would just listen to Breaking Benjamin or something, And that's kind of how I feel about The Order of Things. It's just really nothing special. There is a few good songs that I think are pretty good, but this album is really hard to go back to, honestly. There's even some songs like Divide that even gave me a Skillet vibe, which is just, that's not a terrible track or anything, but it's just a little something that I've noticed. But yeah, The Order of Things, it's definitely one of their weakest. Next up, we got their debut album, Behind Silence and Solitude. Now, I actually wanted this album to be a little bit higher on my ranking, but I personally just can't. There's not really a whole lot to go back to on this album. It is, of course, their debut, and, since this came out in the early days of the band, the production, of course, you're going to have some problems with the production. The production on this album, needless to say, isn't really that great, and that's why I have to have it so low on my list. Now, here's the thing that I want to point out. Production isn't always everything, not everything has to have, quality production, you know what I'm saying? So, but it's just, I don't know, it's just the replay value of this album. Now, the thing is with this album, I like it, I think it's a good album, but there's just not a lot to go to on this album. I do think there are some really good songs on this album, like Clarity. Clarity is definitely my favorite song on this album. If you like guitar, check out this song. And there's other good songs on this album too, of course, like Follow and Erase. And I think really the main highlight for this album is the guitar work. I think the guitar work really does take the spotlight for this album, The whole band does a really good job on this album. Not their best, but still, I think it's a pretty good album. Now, next up, we got A War You Cannot Win. I actually wanted this album to be below their debut, but, I can't deny this album's replay value is just a tad stronger. Now, that's not to say that this album has, amazing replay value or anything, because this album definitely still has its problems. This is, this was the album that came before the order of things, of course, so you kind of saw where All That Remains was going on this album. This album is one of their most commercial albums, and with some songs it works and some others it really doesn't. This, of course, has one of their biggest songs, which is What If I Was Nothing. Now, do I like this song? I think it's okay. I think it's really overrated and, kind of cheesy in a way, but I can't say that I mind the song too much. As for the ballads off this album, I actually really like Asking Too Much. That, to me, is actually kind of an underrated All That Remains ballad, or, radio rock-friendly song or whatever. But, yeah, this album, it's got, some heavy moments, like You Can't Fill My Shadow and, Just Moments in Time. And, there are some heavy moments on this album, but it does lean a little more commercial. But I think, for what the album is as a whole, it does a good job at everything that it does. So I can't hate on the album too much. Sure, it's not one of their best, but I still think it's a pretty good album. Okay, so next up, we got For We Are Many. Now, I know that there's going to be some people that disagree with me having this album placed where it is on my ranking. I know there's people that would place this in the top 2, but I don't know. For me, this album has to take this spot. Now, the thing is with this album, I do like this album. I think it is a very good album. I think, when it comes to balancing the heaviness and melody, it does do a good job there. I mean, for the most part, this album has a decent balance between the aggression and melody, and I kind of like that about this album. Sure, there's still some mainstream stuff on this album and some commercial stuff, but I think for what the album is, it's pretty good, and I can't really diss on the album that much. I mean, I think it's a really good album. So for We Are Many, I think it's a good album. So next up, we actually got their most recent album that came out a few years ago, Victim of the New Disease. This album, I mean, I remember being very impressed when this album came out. Like, this album really, pretty much destroyed anything that All That Remains did, like, a little bit prior to the album. Like, I think it destroys Order of Things, Madness, and pretty much all those albums. I was really blown away by this album. This is easily their best album in years, I think. And yeah, it's such a great album. My real gripe with this album is the album is a little short. I do wish this album was a little bit longer, but I also have to take in consideration that this album came out only a year and a half after Madness, so they probably only had a little bit of time to make this album. So yeah, that's something to keep in mind as well. But for what this album is, it's really good. Songs like F Love is just maybe one of their heaviest songs. I don't know. I just really enjoy the aggression and rawness of this song, and Phil's scream at the end of the song. There's other great songs, of course, like Blood I Spill and Wasteland, which are just, I mean, if you're into metalcore, these are definitely some songs that you'll enjoy. I also really like I Meant What I Said, which is more commercial, but I do like it. Definitely a great album. I mean, I barely have any complaints with this album. Now, sure, it doesn't have the best replay value in the world or anything, but it's still a very solid release. So yeah, Victim of the New Disease, it's a really great album. So now we are here in the top 3. So next up we got This Darken Heart, which is their second album, and yeah, definitely a solid album for sure. I mean, if you like metalcore, check out this album if you haven't already. It's such a great album. You got many great songs on here, like The Deepest Gray, the title track, and Tattered on My Sleeve. Definitely a lot of great stuff on this album. I mean, definitely check it out if you are an All That Remains fan, if you haven't already for some reason, or if you're someone that's only familiar with All That Remains' more recent material, go back and check out this album, because this album, it's really solid. If you like metalcore, you'll probably like this album. That's all I really got to say about it. I mean, and also the influence. I got to give credit to what All That Remains was incorporating with their influence on this album. Because I definitely hear some Melodeath on this album. I know that All That Remains is very Melodeath influence, especially with their earlier work. You can hear some early In Flames work maybe in their material, but yeah, definitely great stuff. Had to put Darkest Heart this high on my list. Really great album. Next up, we got Overcome. Now, maybe the reason that this album is really high on my ranking is because this does have the first All That Remains song that I heard, which was 2 Weeks. I really enjoyed this song, still enjoy it today. It is a more commercial song, but I do like it. Now, the thing is with Overcome, this is kind of the album that I feel like really divided the All That Remains fan base, since this is the first album where they kind of went a little more commercial. Not like, completely commercial like the order of things or anything, but it's still a very solid release and I do enjoy it. I think this album also does a good job, not only just a good job, but All That Remains probably did the best job on this album when it comes to the balance between the heaviness and melody. Sure, you got your more commercial stuff, but you also got your, heavier stuff as well. Yeah, definitely a great album, and definitely check it out if you haven't already. If you're into any kind of metalcore or maybe modern metal in general, check out this album if you haven't already. So at number 1, you guys probably know at this point what number 1 is for me. That is The Fall of Ideals. Now this album, I just really like everything about this album. To me, there's not really a weak point on this album. Sure, there's some songs better than others, and sure, maybe there is a least favorite or weakest track on the album, but even in saying that, this album is like near flawless. This album, I think, is absolutely fantastic. There's really a lot to like about this album. If you are into metalcore, you gotta check out this album if you haven't already. Very solid release. Many great songs like This Calling, Not Alone, Whispers, 6, which is one of my personal favorite All That Remains songs, The Air That I Breathe. I mean, there's just a lot to like about this album. Definitely a very great album, and everything just works very well with this album. I mean, has some of the band's best guitar work, and, aggression, and just, there's a lot to like about this album. So, Fall of Ideals, definitely number 1, and it's kind of always been my number 1 for me. Well, there you go, guys. That is my ranking for the All That Remains discography. Let me know what you guys think. So, with that being said, thanks for watching, have a nice day, and take care.